Hello and welcome to this Heritage Week lecture on recent architectural history. My name is Ellen Rowley and I am a lecturer in UCD School of Architecture. The title of this talk is Back to the Street, and it's a whistle-stop tour of Dublin's changing housing architecture during the 1970s. I am the editor and lead consultant on Dublin City Council's Heritage project into the 20th century architecture of Dublin City. This is a project that has been running phase by phase since 2011, and the Heritage Office of Dublin City Council has organised this series of talks for Heritage Week to celebrate and mark the forthcoming publication of Volume 3 of More Than Concrete Blocks. And the 3 volumes of More Than Concrete Blocks are part funded by the Heritage Council. And Volume 3, as you can see, we don't have a cover of it yet because we're writing it this year and hoping to bring it to publication at the end of next year, 2022. And it deals with the period 1973 to 1999 or 2000. So there are 3 decades under investigation in this volume: 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s. But the more maybe beleaguered decades of the 1970s and 1980s are of particular interest to me and my research for the book, which comprises essays on the Papal Cross as a representation of the Papal visit in 1979, an essay, for instance, on an office building near Jervis Street, an essay on the Catholic Church in the suburb of Donamead, and more. But for today, I'll be discussing shifts and trends in Dublin's social housing during the fairly turbulent decade of the 1970s. My title, Back to the Street, is taken from architect Gerry Cahill, who in the late 1970s undertook a study on the desecration of Dublin's inner city, and he called that Back to the Street. That study was sponsored by UCD and Cement Roadstone, and Gerry went on to teach in UCD, retiring only recently, and became a very notable housing architect working for, or rather designing buildings for different housing associations. So taking this idea from Gerry, just to read some from his introduction, quote, "Without an inner city population, the urban lifeblood is drained, resulting in a place without identity or meaning, except when the office goers or theatre and cinema goers, rather office workers or theatre and cinema goers are present. Such is the state that Dublin's inner city is rapidly approaching. The city communities are disappearing and the dereliction grown more noticeable every day. So much of Dublin, apart from the very few privileged streets and squares, look like the bombs have just stopped falling." So what Cahill is pointing out there is exactly this image from the mid-1960s by amateur photographer Hugh Doran from the Irish Architectural Archive. And his albums in the archive are superb. They capture kind of everyday scenes of Dublin from this period. But what Cahill is also doing as an architect and designer is celebrating through the book and through the study the street. And as he writes, quote, "The street is the generator of diversity. Its value is the city's value." So this kind of celebration of the street by the critical architect and also by the resident alike, he is focusing on the area, kind of Dublin's, the part of the like most historic Dublin, the Liberties. And as well as focusing on the street, what comes out kind of inadvertently, well, maybe it's not inadvertent, but for our purposes, as an introduction to architectural history, is this shift. And it's really a very kind of vocal rejection at this point in the 1970s of modernist town planning by certain critical architects and those more participatory residents alike. And so I include this image here on the left of Le Corbusier's famous Plan Voisin, which was a 1920s vision, a very determinist, modernist vision for Paris, whereby he would raise much of the historic context of the city to the ground and place office workers in these cruciform high-rise buildings in the centre, and place those same people in various, segregated, zoned neighbourhoods outside the city, again in a kind of a mix of very particular housing. So this kind of modernist, determinist urban planning is by the 1970s being rejected. So we're really interested in this lecture in that shift and in that direction, because what it does, it underpins the direction of this 1970s housing history. And it's what I would call a very significant, or well, any paradigm shift is, but it is a substantial paradigm shift. Which we can see written up on this screen here, was the image of demolition on Dominic Street in Dublin's north inner city. And by paradigm shift, what I'm talking about here is really the complete rejection of flats and flat living, and the development then, instead of flats in the city, of low rise, high density housing. So by low rise, I mean rising to 1, 2, or 3 stories. And by high density, where there's a large number of people living together. So that's our overarching story today, and its motive, as with much of this architectural history, is to uncover the intentions behind and the aspirations of ordinary buildings in Dublin's recent history. So the everyday built stuff of our city. In this case, and I suppose there again, we have this paradigm shift and cause and effect. And if the story really is very much something causes an effect. And so on the left, we have an image of flats mid-demolition. And on the right, we have this housing type that I was curious about. So in this case, I wanted to know about that building type on the right, where all these which I presume to be 1980s red brick schemes came from. And how did they proliferate? And the conclusion being, from the built evidence around the city, is that this housing became the last of Dublin Corporation's 20th century housing types. Though, of course, there were housing experiments emerging in the 1990s, none of these experiments were repeated enough or were impactful enough to become a type. So this red brick, low rise, like up to 3-story, holds fast, becoming a type. And I wanted to know why. And so I suppose implicitly we're thinking about the paradigm shift, and we're also thinking about how a type might emerge within architecture. And a type, I suppose, emerges when we're dealing with complicated land purchasing, when we're dealing with, the need and supply for housing at this time, and indeed we're encountering it today very much so. So growing social need, but also aggressive political deadlines, and then economic imperatives around, materials and purchasing land. So type comes out as the only way, and I suppose I have an example here of a housing type that barely moves really, that barely changes from the 1930s corporation suburban cottages, terraces as they were known, cottages, from 1930s on the left right up to the 1973 type. But they are the one type, I suppose. Another example of an enduring type, and type must endure to be a type, would be the schools programme of the OPW. And there's an example from the mid-1940s on the left, and then an enduring or an adaptation showing the endurance of the type on the right, with Paul Dillon Architects' Kilrickle National School, which has been adapted by Paul Dillon, but according to the type. So type is the only way when you're dealing with these aggressive political deadlines and growing social need. I would say type brings about a rigor coming out of pattern making and repetition. And it's the only way within Ireland, as far as I can see, to make social infrastructure, state-sponsored social infrastructure. So that's kind of the implicit question. Back to the street, the title of our talk. As these two images suggest, Jerry Cahill's story from the late 1970s of the city centre falling into neglect goes back past the 1970s, beyond the 1960s, which is indeed the date of these two images, left another image from Hugh Doran's albums. And in this instance, it's up near Christchurch and the Liberties, St. Auden's Wasteland, 1965. The image on the right is taken by that wonderful photographer, Ellen Rowley. Her collections are in the National Library of Ireland. And this is a street protest on York Street, or rather a protest against the eviction. And it's part of the 1963 housing crisis. So the neglect, the urban desecration, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say, is goes past the 1970s, goes back into the 1990s, and indeed really is rooted in 1920s capitalist theories around obsolescence. That the city is no longer that the city is no longer the place for residential life. In these modernist times, the traditional city and its residents are obsolescent or obsolete. And as such, the slum clearance program of the 1930s and 1940s are really what strips the city of its neighborhoods bit by bit. Certainly by the 1960s, we have these images of urban desecration, vacancy, and a general culture of crisis. Obviously, this is all broad brush, but it's presented here as more than a preface to our 1970s situation. Specifically, I point us to the York Street eviction image, and then to the first in a chain of cause and effect housing events. And of course, the image that I'm showing you here is that kind of, ultimately recognizable view of that edge city housing experiment, Ballymun Estate, built from 1965 to 1969, and really, except for the 400 houses, all of the original architecture has been demolished today in 2021. But Ballymun Housing Estate was examined in volume 2 of the More Than Concrete Blocks series. This wildly radical architecture, wildly radical for Ireland, as in system built and high rise, had its genesis in the housing crisis of 1963 and points emphatically to something very important for our 1970s story. And that is, at this time, the establishment in the 60s of distrust of the city as a healthy place to live. As we know, I mean, it's a well-known history. In June 1963, Dublin had experienced extreme heat and storms, following which 3 tenement houses collapsed on Fenian and Bolton streets in the south and north inner city, causing death and catalysing this housing crisis. The Irish press particularly recorded the subsequent hysteria, whereby Dublin Corporation evacuated 156 houses in the space of 1 week and demolished some 1,200 homes over the following 18 months. Housing protests ensued, and as contemporary RTÉ footage illustrates, this was a period of housing hardship and extreme living conditions for the less well-off in Dublin. And I'd urge you, if you have access to the internet, to go on to the RTÉ archives and look at some of that footage. It was in this climate of protest and tragedy that the government sought radical solutions. Importantly, underpinning any solution was this growing official distrust of the city centre. This urban context, historic and traditional, had by then become stigmatised by overcrowded and unsafe tenement housing. And that is really key to this kind of discourse today of cause and effect, and this moment in the 1970s that I've identified as being a moment of a massive paradigm shift. A greenfield edge city site was seen as the way forward, and an opportunity to make a fashionable Swedish or British new town type of development arose when University College Dublin sold the Albert College site in Ballymun to Dublin Corporation in 1964. This was an emergency situation, and traditional building technologies simply weren't fast enough. It wasn't productive enough. So the minister at the time, Niall Blaney, was very taken with an efficient French building method called balancier choule, with precast concrete wall units that we made in the factory and lifted on site by cranes, and poured concrete in situ floors. So in order to convince his officials in his own department, and indeed, importantly, in order to convince Dublin Corporation, he organised in April 1964 a study tour to experience system-built housing in Paris, Stockholm and Copenhagen. And the long and short of it is that a mechanised system, half French, half English, was chosen to make this new edge city for Ireland. And these images show you the production, the factory that was made in Ballymun, built there to construct the tower in the middle. And then the lid is lifted off a flat here to show you the generous proportions in the rooms of a single flat unit. Also a new agency, the National Building Agency, the NBA, was established at this time from 1960 to 1963 in order to oversee this this massive, unprecedented construction project on the edge of Dublin. There was more or less full occupation of the estate by 1969. And already into, this is another Eleanor Wiltshire photograph, by the way, already certainly into the early 1970s, the media and academia were intent upon reporting Ballymun Estate's demise. Now, not the whole estate, but because of the delay in services, that is like the making of a town centre, leisure amenities and so on, as well as the slovenly maintenance of the technology. And by that, really, I'm talking about lifts. The towers housing people in these tall buildings became the sociological scapegoat. Student sociological studies and journalistic accounts were substantiated then by medical investigations into public health at Ballymun, most especially around the mental well-being of the tower block residents. And this is really the emergence in the 1970s, an increased interest in the anthropology of architecture, I should say. And there's a real glut of housing reports to do from the perspective of psychology and sociology and within the academic sectors. But this kind of shift from utopia to dystopia very, very quickly, really, I would say, saw the new minister of local government in October 1973, Minister James Tully, and he's part of this very interesting coalition between Fine Gael and Labour, which we'll come back to at the end of the lecture. So Jim Tully, stated that he would not sanction any more local authority housing over 3 stories in height, except in streetscapes where such massing was necessary or fitting, appropriate. Now that's a key moment when officialdom catalysed by architectural form and technology. And by architectural form and technology, I'm talking about the high-rise tower that you can see on the screen. So the high-rise tower catalyses the official, and this instigates a paradigm shift. I suppose it sounds the death knell of flats, or the death knell for flats. It's not coincidental then, as our essay in this forthcoming volume of More Than Concrete Blocks on Darndale Estate describes, that this strange yet familiar housing estate, Darndale, emerged in the shadow of Ballymun's towers as a way of reacting against the perceived threats of high-rise housing on the soul and health of Irish family life. So this is Darndale. This is a photograph taken in 2011, and here is an aerial view from the 1970s. This is from the amazing Crampton collection of photographs, which can be found on UCD's digital library, and it's open to everybody to see. So in 1974, this estate of Darndale, when it was mid-construction, was hailed Dublin's, quote, most interesting housing project to date. Clara Street, writing for the Plan magazine, described it and described that it signalled, quote, a radical departure from the standard layout and has separated pedestrians from the motor car. The magazine pointed to the estate's experimental nature in terms of the overall layout, which, as you can see, is really tightly knit, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also in relation to the individual units, which each house, its building technology is original and new, and it's based on a dry-lined concrete block module, which does away with wet trades being on site. So it's faster and it's cheaper. It's very important. So this two-story pitched roof and concrete module world was at once recognizable in that it was, a housing estate, but yet it was different for Dubliners. While the houses looked familiar in their terraces and that they're two-story and they've pitched roofs, their facades were starker than Dublin Corporation houses at nearby Coolock and elsewhere. Their windows were smaller and fewer. Their walls were less textured, but least familiar of all were the network of narrow lanes feeding from semi-private courts and leading out to half-developed fields and the ring road beyond. The estate was captivated, or rather has captivated, it's been big in popular culture, the kind of the literary and photographic imagination around neglect and poverty. It was written in novel and film as a late 20th century slum, most particularly in the otherwise joyous 1991 film The Commitments, and then in the stark Magnum photographic series by Martine Frank from 1993. Beginning soon after the estate's full occupation, residents and community groups began to question the built fabric and layout. This was a series of interconnected squares generating the estate's layout. One of its quirkier features were these network of narrow streets, which were only 9 feet wide in some instances and were marked by archways housing bedrooms. Though there were over 20 different house variations, plan variations and 8 different house types, 90% of the houses were 3-bedroomed. 7% were 4-bedroomed and only 3% were 2-bedroomed. But overall, the layout was idiosyncratic, very unusual, and related to a system adapted. Maybe we might look at that again, this slide again, and the aerial view. The layout is coming from Radburn, which is a system of segregating vehicles from pedestrians. Cars were to be kept to the periphery, encircling the estate via a ring road, entering only as far as parking bays. And so there were a system of larger pedestrian malls, smaller pedestrian streets, and then courtyards, which would be shared by up to 9 households. And one of Darndale's initial claims was that it was designed so that anyone could walk from one part of the estate to another without having to cross a road or encounter a car. So theoretically, the layout involved parking spaces at the rear of the houses and communal spaces to the front, in the hope always to champion pedestrians. And interestingly, the idea of the designers was to stimulate encounters between neighbours and encourage better relations. And the whole point there was that in many cases from the 1930s, the new housing estates were considered to be too open, say at Crumlin and Cabra, and that the people who were moved there were used to smaller streets and lanes, city lanes, and that they were missing the constant encounter with their neighbours in the new estate. So Darndale was conceived of to kind of remedy that problem. So in reality, the separation between the outside world, cars and people created an island effect, leading to a lack of efficient surveillance and leading to no passive surveillance at Darndale, which in turn bolstered crime and fed antisocial behaviour. The pedestrian walkways enabled criminals quick escape, while the cul-de-sac trapped Gardaí. So through the 1980s, the estate then became increasingly notorious for this antisocial behaviour, and houses became vacant. Many original residents moved on. Social amenity was largely absent, and the estate had the highest unemployment rate in Ireland. And its curious layout and morphology was blamed for these incessantly high crime rates. And Questions were raised in the Dáil. There was a visit by the then Taoiseach, and it really became high profile and the byword in housing design of what not to do in Ireland. By the end of the 1980s, there was a major programme initiated to refurbish the estate phase by phase. The primary act in this refurbishment was the reversal of houses. So on this screen on the left, we have pre-reversal from 1990 and after the photographs we took for the volume from 2019, where the backs are now the front. And also the facades were all pebble dashed and given more texture. This reversing of houses had a huge impact on the scheme's layout because alleyways were blocked off and pedestrian malls, semi-private, semi-communal spaces previously at the front of houses were now incorporated into backyards. And really importantly, where the pedestrian was to be championed, that was thrown out and rejected. And the original plan to keep cars out of the estate was overturned. So parking was brought into the centre of living. So why did this estate happen? Thinking of 1970s housing patterns and ideas, I would argue and have argued already that it came about as a significant reaction to Ballymun. At Darndale, as a marked improvement upon Ballymun estate, for instance, this Catholic Church and Community Hall were designed as one single prefabricated structure. And this was finished in December 1974 at the same time as the first houses. But other than the primary school, nothing tangible followed for 25 years until the 1999 International Architectural Competition for a new community centre. According to Dublin Corporation's Housing Committee, Darndale was approved already in late 1968, and at that point it was to be another ex-urban or suburban scheme of about 3,000 units. Arguably, the brief was to make something less open than Ballymun and at higher density than recent other suburban colonies, housing colonies. Certainly the architects, Arthur Lardner and partners, were studying recent London City Council and Greater London Council developments, which were turning away from low density high rise to high density low rise. So it's really important, this shift in densities and you know, for 1 or 2 stories in this instance. And in many ways, as I said, Darndale Estate was the architect's attempt at remaking a slice of traditional city housing, but in a new greenfield site. In the end, the estate was broken up into 5 areas, and instead of 3,000 houses, there were 921. And as I say, it was modelled on British examples, very recent housing, namely in Hampshire, at Andover and this new town of Andover, this whole new town, and one scheme, Cricketer's Way. And so Darndale's houses were to be, you know, very much higher density, determinedly low 2-story, and very much set into a pedestrianised context. The architects also distanced their designs from Dublin Corporation housing estates at Cabra and Crumlin and so on by keeping them lower cost and at a density of 16 houses per acre rather than, say, 12 to 14 at Crumlin and Cabra from the 1930s. In the city centre, the same motivations that struck up a new typology for the 1970s suburbs at Darndale brought about a reactionary housing type. Again, reminding ourselves of Minister Jim Tully's dictum that no housing over 3 stories would be built unless absolutely contextually necessary. We remember again our paradigm shift. So flats with Ballymun as catalyst were emerging in this new government as the baddie. But not just flats. I mean, there was more to it than that, to do with system building that we'll look at towards the end of this talk. But also there is the maisonette flats in the city, which were becoming another evil protagonist in the story. So here's a view of 3 different schemes of the maisonette blocks. By maisonette, these are primarily duplex, so it's like basically small houses. But these are 5-story blocks with quirky features, such as the gull wing roofs, gull wing or butterfly roofs that we see here, and also these circular freestanding stair towers. The flat blocks consisted of a ground floor single story unit, usually for one person or elderly housing, and then a duplex story and another duplex story. So 2-story and again 2-story. And there are about 30 of these schemes repeated, put up around the city. One of the earliest schemes built in part to generate the North Strand bomb site was discussed in volume 2 of More Than Concrete Blocks, and that was Charleville Mall. Here's a view of Charleville Mall from the balcony over towards 2 of the other parallel blocks in that scheme. As discussed in More Than Concrete Blocks volume 2, this scheme at Charleville Mall was a type whereby the density was to be for about 100 people living there on an acre. And so there's a decent amount of people per acre while not being intimidatingly high. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of the memory of the tenements. That's crucial to all of this. As I've argued elsewhere, Dublin's flats from their earliest iterations in the 1930s under Herbert Simms' scheme, and by iterations I mean the first type, so when a lot of them are made and it's repeated, through to the second generation of the started in 1958, but really the second generation here, the maisonettes were designed through the 1960s primarily, but they continue, as we'll see, into the 1970s. But they were designed in reaction to the tenements, with the tenements' interior stair hall and shared hall and stairs. As such, circulation and access in the flats was pulled outside these new blocks, enabling greater visual surveillance. This maisonette type continued to be built as a way of regenerating slum clearance and brownfield sites. But by brownfield, I mean maybe formerly industrial sites, into the 1970s. And the reputed last scheme was Fitzgibbon Court, which is one of the schemes that I'm looking at in an essay in More Than Concrete Blocks volume 3. And it's because Fitzgibbon Court is the last scheme that we're interested in how they changed from the late 1950s model through to the end, through the 1970s, and how were they rejected, or rather, why might they have been rejected? So that's a view on the left of the street front, Fitzgibbon Street, and on the right is a view of the kind of more private access side, which is at the back of Mountjoy Square and also fronting North Circular Road to an extent, in a pocket of land touching North Circular Road. As we see in this drawing here, shared by Susan Rowntree, formerly of Dublin City Architects, this is a, this is a type, a generic. Here's an elevation of which basically shows us the vertical pattern and also the horizontal pattern, the relationship of door to window and so on. And I think what's really interesting is how constant much of this is through the type right up until the end with Fitzgibbon Court, which has a mixed date, but let's say for today, 1973 to 1977. So this type was designed in 1958 and continues to be built around the city until the mid-1970s. And so much, I think, as I say, that's interesting. Like there's a constant floor plan, for instance. And at Fitzgibbon Court, what we get is flats behaving like cottages. So these are like mini cottages stacked on top of each other. Internally, the floor plan was the same, with the ground floor, kitchen, living room, balcony, and a stair hall, the small stairs leading to a landing and 2 or 3 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs. Also, what we see is the maisonette type becoming streamlined. So by the time of Fitzgibbon Court, there are no mosaic friezes, there are no quirky roof profiles, but flat roof. There are no zany stair towers. Saying that, effort has been made here in Dublin 1 Fitzgibbon Street to bring some delight in detail and to situate, importantly, to situate the blocks more thoughtfully in relation to the surrounding streets. By the time of Fitzgibbon Court, so here's a view of Fitzgibbon Court, and I suppose I should point out, if you can see my cursor, this is North Circular Road here, this is Fitzgibbon Street, and there's a significant, and here is Mountjoy Square, and this is Belvedere Place. So it touches kind of Fitzgibbon Street, Belvedere Place, and North Circular Road, but really these two. And importantly, it's set within a lot of historic housing, older housing, and there is a significant drop in sight from Mountjoy Square down to North Circular Road, and this scheme tries to negotiate that shift in site level. By the time of Fitzgibbon Court, though, the formula had gotten tired, and city architects were arguably aiming for greater site sensitivity. Unlike precedent schemes, maybe I'll go back, where the blocks would normally occupy their sites in parallel formation, irrespective of the surrounding neighbourhood, Fitzgibbon Court puts the two main blocks addressing the primary street of Fitzgibbon Street here, and then puts the second block at perpendicular to the main axis, thus creating some kind of sense of enclosure. In these series of sections and threshold studies, so threshold treatment is really how the building touches the ground and how the residents access the building. And what kind of journey you go on from the public life of the city into the private life of your domain. And so that is roughly called the threshold. And in a series of studies by UCD architecture student Cian Neville, the sense of the threshold is addressed here in Fitzgibbon Court. So this is a section through the two larger blocks fronting Fitzgibbon Street, where the bus is, and so kind of we're standing on North Circular Road, essentially. And what we can see, unlike precedent maisonette schemes where blocks, as I say, occupy their sites in parallel, we see with Fitzgibbon Court, it's set back from the street and at a lower level than the sloping street, in an attempt to also address the perpendicular North Circular Road. So we have the very, very typical circulation pattern coming up the stair tower, and we can move horizontally on the first floor here and on the third floor. But really, you're entering this scheme in a very deliberate way across, as Cian shows us in these different bands of colour. So if the pinky colour is the public, and then we go across a raised pavement and into the green, whereby there's a shift in space, there's a shift in horizon. We go up a few steps onto a path and into the back of the blocks where the flats can be accessed. And in this way, there are clear zones of private and public space. There's a sequence, I suppose, and the sequence brings the pedestrian from the street via this prolonged entrance to the blocks, stairs, and areas of circulation. And that sequence is, in a way, very subtly transformational, insofar as the pedestrian is aware, through shift in level and path, that the pedestrian is somewhere different, is somewhere private, and really is in the flats at this point. And Cian's study also looks at what level of surveillance can happen in these schemes. In terms of threshold treatment, Fitzgibbon Court did go far to improve upon the ill-considered citing of other maisonette schemes, which, being mostly concerned with their north-south orientation, tended to ignore the historic pattern of their neighbouring streets. But there is still this ambivalent duality between private and public, and that continues at Fitzgibbon Court around kind of the private access and circulation and the public balcony front. And residents continue to live to this day in a stacked up vertical manner, sharing public stairwells. And the reaction against this ambivalence came with the Ashgrove Commission in the Liberties. So here's a view of the Ashgrove housing scheme, or it's also known as the North Coombe housing scheme. And it was designed from 1968 to 1978. And it's probably something that people have passed and not looked up and noticed before. So please do go and walk around it and have a look. And it's very important because it really represents through activism the dawn of a new type. So it's where the paradigm shift is made material, if you like. The full rejection of flats is all played out on this site. The initial motivation for this project were the aggressive modernist road plans and city expansion plans emerging in the 1960s, namely, and excuse the very bad slide on the left, I found it in haste, the Schechterl Plan of 1965. German civil engineer Dr. Karl Schechterl was commissioned by Dublin Corporation to carry out the second, I suppose, studies into Dublin's traffic flow. The first had been undertaken in the late 50s by Dublin Corporation. But among Schechterl's many proposals, which are too significant to get into now, was a new road. Well, there was constantly promoting the conversion of the Grand Canal into a road. But it was a series of kind of a big road running around the circumference of the city, and then these important inner relief tangents or inner relief roads. And these would be in places 3-lane dual carriageways. So the plan was from 1965, and it was developed further by Miles Wright's plan for Dublin of 1967, and then the Travers Morgan plan of 1971. And they were each to varying degrees about expanding the city and also getting people into the city fast. So the language was 3-lane dual carriageways, inner relief road, flyover bridge roads, and the automobile was the king. So the primacy of the car is really important. This, of course, was started with Abercrombie and Crumlin and Cabra, but it really reaches its zenith with these plans. And what is interesting is that in response to the plans to demolish old neighbourhoods, old streets in the Liberties area, to mow the motorway through, the residents, or some residents, organised themselves into the LRA, that's the Liberties Residents Association. The hero of the piece was a local Liberties man called Larry Dillon. And importantly, this this LRA, this association, didn't just go about this themselves. They pretty quickly appointed an architect. Well, it was basically a new practice. They were architecture and urban design called Delaney McVeigh Pike, and they were formed in 1964 in order to put in something for the UCD competition in Belfield in Stillorgan. But it's very interesting to see this group of residents initiate a commission with these architects. The key motivation for change was indeed the desire for an alternative threshold treatment. First off, the Liberties residents did not want their homes to be stacked. And as such, tall 5-storey bulky blocks were to be replaced with mostly 3- and 2-storey buildings as various combinations of single and 2-storey homes. Secondly, Ash Grove arose in a completely bespoke manner, responding to the particularities of the Liberties streetscape and the very historic urban landscape. The locals said no to flats, no to relocation to Bally Far Outs, as they called them, no to multi-lane dual carriageways, and yes to traditional artisan dwelling models and those dwelling patterns and street patterns that were so significant and characteristic of the local environment of the Liberties and much of the inner city within the canals of Dublin, north and south. So the residents got their way amazingly, and the image on the left repeated shows you the residents being shown the scheme as it was being worked out. It's from a local Liberties newspaper. So through the residents' hard work and advocacy and the quite brilliant design talent of the young architect James Pike, they got their way, but the process was protracted. And while they employed the architects in 1968, the scheme wasn't finished until 1978. So it was a decade in the making, but major change happened in that space and time. James Pike studied the area, and here are some sketches on the left that he made that were published in this brilliant book from 1978 called Dublin, a City in Crisis. And James Pike studied the neighbourhood and the block of land that was, or kind of around, I suppose, identifying a block and making a new block effectively. But he studied existing streets, and he studied the changing levels in the area, and basically absorbed the character of the place. And key to his rejection, or rather, excuse me, key to his design was the rejection of the Dublin Corporation 5-storey flat blocks, which you can see in the middle sketch here, where he has placed 2 flat blocks in a typical pattern that was emerging by this period, such as we saw in Fitzgibbon Street. And he's at pains to show how uncontextual these 5-storey flat blocks are, not making enough of the skyline, the spires of the neighborhood, the shifts in level, etc. And it's kind of, I suppose, they just make these unconnected, freestanding blocks that don't relate. So what we see here is in the lower image here by James Pike is the plan that he emerges, where we have a building that holds very tight to 3 streets: Carmen's Hall, Mead Street, and the Coombe. And so it's what we might call a perimeter block, holding tight and forming a new street edge, most publicly to Mead Street and the Coombe. But by listening to his clients and studying and valuing the historic urban terrain, he comes up with these new cuts and courtyards. So there's a courtyard, very substantial courtyard here with the shift in level as the site slopes down, and a smaller courtyard here, and then makes this new public cut, a pedestrian stepped link, which of course visually links to church spires wherever possible. So he's making and shaping these new 35 housing units according to level change and according to existing streets. So through a prolonged process, and here we see the scheme in construction, the housing scheme, which also included 5 shops and a community centre, today a creche in 2021, it went to site by 1975 and was complete by 1978. And here are some views from 2021. And to just quote from James Pike when he was planning all of this, and in 1978 in the essay he writes for Dublin, a City in Crisis, he talks about, quote, "In respecting the pattern of existing streets, the precise relationship of the street to the dwelling becomes of major importance. Is the ground floor raised 2 or 3 steps above the pavement? Is there a small front garden? Can raised pavements be used for further separation? Considerable natural changes in level can be used to give access to upper stories while maintaining contact with the ground. And the proximity of a development area of the Coombe to the busy Mead Street shopping area provides immediate contact with the bustle of city life," unquote. So we see all of these ideas played out, and the variety of threshold whereby you're either coming in from the street under a deep cut porch with a change in step, or you're moving in through the courtyard and you're going up onto these balconies. These really are raised streets in the air. That corporation residents of the city centre might have their own front door to their own house, fed from a public pavement with minimal, or better still, varied shared access and circulation, was the primary benefit for Dubliners of this typological phenomenon. In fairness to the maisonette blocks, they were Dublin Corporation's attempt to provide a cottage within a flat block framework. But the activism and appetite for an alternative to flats showed how flats by the early 70s, by the late 60s indeed, were considered architectural pariah. And this, I suppose, rejection or shift away from flats motivated the major next move by Dublin Corporation when they launched an unprecedented housing competition. And this is the last, I suppose, situation where we're going to discuss today before we conclude. So bear with me. And just to quote from the introduction of the Dublin Corporation Housing Competition, which was from 1975, and it was, as I say, unprecedented. Quote, the Dublin Corporation is at present embarked on an extensive housing programme both in the county and city centre areas, and the schemes range from single storey to medium rise in high density sites. This competition is promoted to stimulate new thinking in city centre housing, or centre city housing, which will create a good overall environment for family living. So let's get this straight. There had never been a state-sponsored design competition for housing. The only thing that came close was a competition for an ideal country cottage in 1944. And as such, this was a huge, big deal. And Ashgrove's activism in the Liberties must have been a big influence. But there were other influences too. Not only were flats the perceived baddies in this cause and effect story of the 1970s, but local political shifts and massive international issues were brought to bear here. Firstly, there was, of course, the international oil crisis brought on by the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. And secondly, the new coalition government of Fine Gael and Labour, which we've encountered already from February 1973, replaced the long-standing 16-year Fianna Fáil government, and changes were afoot. This new Minister of Local Government, Labour's Jim Tully, sought to revise the low-cost direction of recent social housing. And he was appalled at the cost of some housing, namely this housing, the no fines housing, which we can see here. There was a fair bit of it in Tallaght and Finglas. And it was really instigated the need to move away from the no fines houses, because look at the roofscape. There are no chimneys, there are no fireplaces. And amidst an energy crisis, you cannot have houses that are so, you cannot have any buildings that are so reliant on oil in this way. So Tully questioned certain alternative housing systems. At Tallaght, to the south of the city, the NBA were busy building vast estates of houses with one of the most successful types, the no fines. And by successful, I mean in terms of cost and time. And this was adapted by Crampton builders of the British post-war Wimpy House, or no fines house. Concrete containing no fine aggregate, so that's where the no fine name comes from, was cast in situ in huge reusable molds and in pairs. So really importantly, it was possible to build 2 houses per day. Now, with the huge development of Tallaght, we can understand how this was very attractive before the oil crisis. Importantly, this house type and others dispensed with the traditional chimney hearth core and relied instead on electric fan heaters. Now, I deal with this in my housing book, which I've just put a slide up on there, but it relied instead on electric fan heaters at the ground floor, over which sat a boiler at first floor level. Now, doing this, similar type of development was at Darndale for different reasons, but it meant that it eliminated the wet trades like plasterers from the building site. So things progressed very quickly on site. So you could build really quickly. Now, according to former Minister of Education and architect Rory Quinn, he was a young architect specialising in housing at this time with Dublin Corporation and later with Burke Kennedy Doyle Architects. And according to Quinn, the prohibitive costs involved in fan heating during the oil crisis made these houses dangerous and uninhabitable because families couldn't afford to heat their house. So according to stories, families made fires in the front room, and there was a lot of, there were accidents as a result of that. No fines and other industrialized housing systems became scapegoats, a little bit like the flats, the high-rise flats. And by 1974, chimneys were already being added to no fines houses at Finglas, thereby undermining their uniquely rapid construction system. So in that space, this housing competition emerges kind of as a rejection of that type of cutting corners as Tully perceived it, this new minister. And he seems to have been keen to move Irish urban housing architecture in a new direction. More research into Irish society was revealing that Irish families did not fit the generic nuclear 3-bedroom house type, with emphasis as well on the city again, the value of the city changing, and particularly emphasis on hybrid sites of newfound value. And by hybrid, I mean, I'm thinking of this site down Dublin City Quay, which has dereliction, but yet it's enriched by traditional housing. And so the corporation has to look at these sites because they're near the city and has to look at them again and revalue them. So if we read what the competition said, quote, "It is the corporation's policy to preserve as much as possible of the housing stock and rehabilitate a certain proportion of the existing houses within a site, together with infilling the balance with new housing. The corporation proposes to draw up a new panel of architectural firms and considers that a competition would be the most appropriate means of identifying architects who have a special talent for centre city housing design and layout," unquote. Now, presuming that the corporation saw what was happening in the Liberties and this new firm, Delaney, McVeigh and Pike, and went, hang on, we need to see what's out there. So they wanted to create a panel of architects. So they put this competition out there. And they really also wanted help with how best to approach these difficult sites near the city centre, where your compulsory purchase orders might be prolonged and delayed. So you could build on a little bit of it and then add to that and add to that. And similarly with City Quay, which is at the edge of the city's commercial centre on the south side of the River Liffey. This was a typically kind of complex place, needing a new through road, bringing the river up to Pearse Street. It contained older housing and, importantly, it contained semi-redundant light industry. So the brief for the competition asked for an unspecified number of new houses, but no higher than 3 stories and at a maximum density of 150 people per acre. They wanted it to be delivered in stages and to incorporate a mixture of larger family homes, so 70% were to be larger family homes, and single person units, as well as community facilities, a pub and playgrounds. There were 85 submissions. This one that we can see here is the winning design, and here it is as built. It was built from 1978, and it's coming into this essay in the book as well. And it's a scheme that we probably know very well and maybe drive by if we're lucky enough we can walk or cycle by, and we mightn't really look at it. It's very much become part of the fabric of that part of the city. It's a very, very successful scheme, and from the look of the units of the homes, very beloved of the residents. There were 85 submissions to the competition, and the assessors, the judges, were a mix of UCD architects and academics, Dublin Corporation officials and foreign architects, and they shortlisted 4 schemes, and those schemes were chosen because they made the greatest effort with recreation and communal facilities. But also when we look at what was built, they made the greatest effort with integrating roads and the housing, as well as bringing in kind of varying house plans and types, while excluding flats. There were to be no flats and there was to be no underground parking. The one that was awarded the gig was called, was the scheme by Kidney Burke Kennedy Doyle. It contained 48 homes, all red brick terraced with pitched roofs, their own front door, and to a certain extent fan lights. Much of the language used In the 85 submissions was to do with kind of the local and the characterful, and one submission wrote, quote, that this was a built form which one immediately identified as Dublin and Dublin alone, unquote. So this sense of a new Dublin urban vernacular coming out. And in reality, the new typology was influenced really by Britain. Indeed, the competition itself provided room dimensions and ceiling heights, all of which came from the very important British Parker Morris report of 1961. And I should also say that the primary architectural assessor on the competition was J.W. Dorburn of Dorburn and Drake of Surrey. So, you know, there was of course, in typical Irish housing style, the presence of the British example as primary. So there were 3-story types, but mostly 2-story family houses, and also on the riverfront, which is the bottom right corner, sorry, you have 2-story over single person units at street level. This scheme was awarded the Silver Medal for Housing from the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland for the period 1979 to 1981. And certainly most impressive for me walking around it is the variety of thresholds and the integration with the road and with the city. Overall, though, many would say that there's a lack of variety through the City Key scheme compared to, say, Ash Grove. But the repetition and strong street presence inherent in the terrace housing idiom were welcome traits worthy of emulation. As City Key was under construction, different forms of this new type were being designed and laid out across Dublin. First off on Clanbrassil Street, the New Street scheme by Delaney McVeigh Pike, and then on North Circular Road on the former cattle market site, Drumalee by City Architects was being built in 1979. For examples, here was the next urban housing programme or type in Dublin Corporation's 20th century portfolio. These red brick terraces were added to the flats and cottages by Herbert Sims' team from the 1930s and to the 1960s maisonettes. Though their openings, windows and doors were kind of mean in scale, and the 3-story family homes were dominated by circulation, they were well received and seemed to have endured. And I'm thinking this week of Kelly Harrington's Olympic success and how her neighbourhood on Portland Row, all of those houses are from this precise building type. And these schemes, indeed, that one at Portland Row, all tried to overlay rather than erase tenement memory. And in so doing, they began to reframe, perceptually at least, Dublin's scarred urban communities from high density slums to medium density homes. So that's the end of my talk. We hope you enjoy these studies, these talks indeed, as tasters of the studies that are coming out in the forthcoming volume of More Than Concrete Blocks. Thank you.